Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your gateway to uncovering hidden insights and illuminating mysteries. I'm thrilled you've joined our global community. Whether you're watching from a bustling city skyline or a quiet countryside, we're glad you're here. Globe showing Europe, Africa, so tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Chapter 1, The Invitation to Wynthorpe Lodge. It was on a damp, grey afternoon in early October that Hercule Poirot received the letter which was to lead him into one of the most curious and most sinister cases of his later years. Outside his London flat, the drizzle fell in a steady mist, softening the outlines of the street lamps and leaving the pavement slick with rain. Inside, all was neatness and order, the polished silver, the straightened cushions, the perfect symmetry of flowers in their vase. Poirot sat at his desk, carefully trimming the end of his moustache when his valet, Georges, entered bearing the afternoon post upon a silver tray. "Only one letter, monsieur," he said. It arrived by hand, marked urgent. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "By hand, you say? How mysterious! Let us see what drama life has delivered to Hercule Poirot today." He took the envelope, thick, cream-coloured, bearing a faint scent of lavender and rain. The handwriting was thin, almost trembling, but clear. Miss Eleanor Vale, Wynthorpe Lodge, near Kingsmere. Inside was a single sheet, written in hurried strokes that seemed to betray both fear and desperation. "Monsieur Poirot, forgive my intrusion upon your time. I do not know where else to turn. Something dreadful is about to occur at Wynthorpe Lodge. My guardian, Colonel Redmayne, has gathered a group of old acquaintances here under pretext of a hunting party, but I fear there is another purpose behind this meeting. There have been strange occurrences in the woods. Lights. Footsteps. Whispering voices that seem to come from nowhere. My guardian laughs at my fears, but I know danger is near. Please, monsieur, come if you can. I shall feel safe only when I see your face at our door. Yours in anxiety, Eleanor Vale." Poirot read the letter twice, his brows knitting together. "Lights in the woods," he murmured. "Whispering voices. Ah, mon Dieu, how curious! And yet, how human the fear behind these words. This young lady, she is frightened not of ghosts, but of men." He leaned back, his fingers steepled. The name Redmayne stirred a faint recollection, a retired colonel of the British Army, once stationed in India, known for his strict discipline and temper. "Georges," Poirot said briskly, "prepare my valise. We travel to Kingsmere this evening." Georges blinked. "At once, monsieur? The rain." "The rain, my good Georges, will not melt the great Hercule Poirot. And where there is fear, there is mystery. And where there is mystery," he tapped the letter with a smile, "there is work for me." By nightfall, Poirot found himself aboard a small local train heading deep into the countryside. The landscape beyond the window was a blur of shadow and motion, dark hedgerows, the occasional flicker of a lantern in a farmhouse window, and, beyond all, the looming mass of the forest. At Kingsmere station, a solitary figure awaited him beneath the flickering lamp, a girl in a dark raincoat, her hands twisting together nervously. "Monsieur Poirot," she asked in a low, uncertain voice. "Indeed, mademoiselle. And you are Miss Eleanor Vale?" She nodded. Her face, pale and fine-boned beneath a cloche hat, bore the unmistakable signs of sleeplessness. "I hardly hoped you would come so soon." Thank you for believing me enough to travel here." "Do not thank me yet," said Poirot kindly. "You spoke in your letter of strange happenings. But tell me, why so much fear?" As they drove in the waiting motorcar through winding lanes bordered by dark trees, she explained. Her guardian, Colonel Arthur Redmayne, had invited several guests to the lodge for what he called a reunion of old comrades. Yet ever since their arrival 3 days ago, unease had settled upon the household. "The colonel behaves oddly," she said. he receives letters that he burns at once. Twice I have heard him arguing late at night with someone in the study, though no one else was there. And last evening, Dr. Haldane, one of the guests, swore he saw a figure watching the lodge from the trees. It vanished before he could reach it. Poirot nodded slowly. And what is this place, this Wynthorpe Lodge? It stands within Wynthorpe Woods, monsieur. The forest goes on for miles, no houses for nearly 10. It used to be a hunting lodge of the Redmayne family, built long ago. They say it was once the scene of something dreadful, though no one speaks of it now. As the car turned off the main road onto a narrow track, Poirot caught his first glimpse of the lodge. It rose out of the mist like some brooding creature, its dark timbered walls glistening with rain, its tall chimneys exhaling thin trails of smoke. Around it, the forest loomed, dense, silent, and watchful. When they reached the porch, the heavy door opened before they could knock. A man of powerful build stood there, his hair white, his eyes sharp and cold as steel. "Miss Vale," he said curtly, "and our guest, I presume." "Monsieur Poirot, the detective." Poirot bowed slightly. "At your service, Colonel Redmayne." "Though heaven knows what service you mean to provide," the colonel said dryly. "I invited you, sir, for Miss Vale's peace of mind, not because I credit her tales of ghosts in the trees." Poirot smiled gently. "I concern myself not with ghosts, Colonel, but with people, who are often far more alarming." A brief flicker crossed the colonel's face, irritation, perhaps even unease, but it was gone as swiftly as it came. He gestured them inside. The hall was large and dim, lit by a few oil lamps. Mounted stags' heads glared from the walls, the air smelled faintly of smoke and damp earth. In the drawing room, several guests sat about the fire, a tall woman with intelligent eyes, a ruddy-faced doctor polishing his spectacles, and a lean man with the bearing of a soldier. Conversation died the moment Poirot entered. The introductions were made: Mrs. Linton, the novelist, Dr. Haldane, the physician, Major Evers, the colonel's old comrade. Each greeted Poirot politely, but with curiosity, and, he fancied, a touch of apprehension. Dinner that evening was a strained affair. Conversation limped from one subject to another, punctuated by awkward silences. At one point, the colonel remarked grimly, "It seems the forest disapproves of visitors." The gamekeeper swears he heard someone moving out there last night. "Perhaps a poacher," suggested Dr. Haldane. "Perhaps," said the colonel. "Or something older." Miss Vale shivered. Poirot, watching her closely, noted how her fingers tightened around her wineglass. The colonel's eyes, meanwhile, held a peculiar gleam, part challenge, part warning. Later, when the guests had retired, Poirot stood for a while at his window. The rain had ceased, but the woods stretched out before him like a sea of blackness. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted. Then, very faintly, came another sound. A whisper. Low, indistinct, like a breath drawn between trees. Poirot listened, his small eyes narrowing. "ABN," he murmured softly. Miss Vale was right. There is something, or someone, in Wynthorpe Woods. And far below, in the darkness, a pale light flickered once among the trees, then vanished. Chapter 2: The Gathering in the Forest. The morning after Poirot's arrival broke with a persistent drizzle, the sky a flat grey canvas over the dense expanse of Wynthorpe Woods. Mist clung to the forest floor, curling around the roots of ancient oaks and pines like ghostly tendrils. The lodge, dark-timbered and brooding, seemed even more isolated than the day before. Every sound, the drip of rain from the eaves, the distant call of a jay, resonated with an eerie clarity. Poirot, impeccably dressed despite the damp, moved with his usual elegance through the hall, noting the subdued manner in which the guests assembled for breakfast. Colonel Redmayne sat at the head of the long table, his face set in its habitual sternness, though his eyes flickered nervously toward the windows. "Good morning, monsieur," said Miss Eleanor Vale softly, her voice carrying the faint tremor of sleepless nights. She had grown paler since the previous evening, as though the very atmosphere of the woods weighed upon her. Poirot inclined his head. "Good morning, mademoiselle. I trust the night passed without incident." "Somewhat," she replied, glancing toward the tall figure of Major Evers, who sipped his coffee with an air of quiet detachment. "But I heard noises, footsteps in the hall." "Perhaps my imagination, monsieur." Poirot's small eyes narrowed slightly. "Ah, Mademoiselle, fear has a way of sharpening the senses. But fear can also deceive." Colonel Redmayne cleared his throat, a signal for attention. "Monsieur Poirot, I must stress that my guests are here for leisure, a hunting party, yes, but nothing more. Any talk of disturbances is nonsense. I will not have my reputation tainted by idle fears." Poirot observed him keenly. His gestures were precise, but his eyes betrayed a subtle tension, a trace of unease masked beneath a disciplined exterior. He noted also the quick glance each guest cast toward the colonel, curiosity mingled with apprehension. After breakfast, the party prepared to venture into the forest. Rain had tapered into a fine mist, leaving the woodland air sharp and fragrant. Colonel Redmayne, wrapped in a heavy coat, led the way on foot, while others followed, some with rifles, others with walking sticks, moving carefully through the muddy paths. Poirot walked slightly apart, surveying the terrain with meticulous attention. Every footfall, every rustle of leaves, every glint of water on the undergrowth was registered by his ever-watchful eyes. Miss Vale walked beside him, her expression anxious. "Do you think something could really be out there, monsieur? Some intruder?" Poirot shook his head with calm certainty. "Mademoiselle, it is far too early to speak of intruders. Nature itself plays tricks upon the mind. The mist, the movement of animals, the creak of trees, all conspire to frighten the nervous. Yet I cannot help but feel watched," she whispered. Poirot's gaze swept the fog-laden forest. "Ah, the human mind, mademoiselle, is a most interesting creature. It perceives what it wishes, and often fears what it imagines. But let us see what evidence the world offers before we surrender to imagination." The party came to a clearing where the colonel had arranged for a brief hunting demonstration. Major Evers demonstrated careful aim, while Dr. Haldane examined the terrain with methodical interest. Mrs. Linton, the novelist, moved along the edge of the clearing, her notebook clasped tightly in hand, sketching the scene with quiet fascination. Poirot's attention, however, was drawn to subtler details, footprints in the mud leading toward the thicket, broken twigs suggesting someone had passed recently, and a thin ribbon caught on a low branch. Crimson against the dull brown of fallen leaves. Poirot bent to examine the ribbon. "Curious," he murmured. "A small detail, but significant. It has been disturbed recently, yet no one admits to its origin. Little clues, mademoiselle, often reveal more than the grandest declarations." Miss Vale watched him, puzzled. "But it is only a ribbon, monsieur. Surely it means nothing." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, mademoiselle, that is precisely what the clever mind of a criminal hopes you will think." By midday, they returned to the lodge for lunch, damp and weary. The atmosphere inside was taut, polite conversation masked undercurrents of tension. Poirot noted the colonel's careful eye upon each guest, as though measuring their reactions, their movements, their very thoughts. He observed too the subtle gestures of Dr. Haldane, whose calm exterior belied a nervous energy in the tapping of his fingers, and Mrs. Linton, whose glances toward the colonel were quick, almost furtive. "Colonel," Poirot asked gently over soup, "do you often entertain such gatherings in the woods?" "Occasionally," Redmayne replied, his voice clipped. "Old friends, hunting, a little camaraderie. Nothing else." Poirot leaned slightly forward, his tone deliberate. And yet, Mademoiselle Vale fears disturbances. Strange lights, voices. Is it merely imagination, or is there reason to consider that someone's intentions are less innocent than the surface suggests? The Colonel's lips tightened. I will not have my household spoken of as haunted. Mademoiselle is young, she has fanciful notions. The woods are old, that is all. Old trees make old sounds. Poirot nodded, not pressing further, but his small, dark eyes gleamed with discernment. He knew already that appearances could be deceiving, and that in this silent, dense forest, secrets could hide in plain sight. As afternoon fell, the mist deepened, and the forest seemed to press closer to the lodge, a living, breathing presence. The guests dispersed to their rooms or to small walks along the edge of the clearing, some in search of solitude, others, like Mrs. Linton, hoping to capture the atmosphere for her work. Poirot chose to remain near the veranda, observing the movement of the woods with careful attention, noting footprints, the slight bend of a branch, the way the mist curled around the trunks of the trees. It was then, as the last light faded and the forest shadows lengthened, that a scream rent the air. High-pitched, piercing, and utterly terrified, it echoed across the trees, carrying a dread that silenced every bird and startled every animal in the clearing. Miss Vale cried out and rushed from the veranda, followed by the Colonel and the others. Poirot, calm but alert, followed without haste, his keen eyes sweeping the forest, registering every detail, the broken branches, the tracks in the mud, the way the mist swirled unnaturally around a distant oak. At the far edge of the clearing, beneath an enormous oak, they discovered the source of the horror. Colonel Redmayne himself? No, something far worse. There, grotesquely suspended from a low branch by a thick rope, was a figure. A human figure, perfectly still, the head tilted in a macabre gesture, the cloak of the victim fluttering in the damp wind. Poirot paused, examining the scene with meticulous care. Every detail, every subtle clue, was absorbed by his prodigious mind, the positioning of the body, the tension of the rope, the footprints leading to and away from the tree, the scattered leaves disturbed by some previous struggle. Mrs. Linton gasped, her hand clutched over her mouth. Who could have done such a thing? Poirot's eyes were small, sharp, and unblinking. That, mademoiselle, is what we shall discover. But let us be clear, this was no accident. No. This was planned with precision, and with malice. As the mist thickened around them, the forest seemed to close in, silent except for the dripping of rain from leaves and the low murmur of distant branches swaying. In that moment, Poirot knew that Wynthorpe Woods held secrets, dark, dangerous, and lethal, and that the game he had entered was only beginning. Chapter 3, The Scream in the Dark. The echo of the scream still reverberated through the mist-laden forest when Poirot arrived at the base of the oak. The dim light of late afternoon filtered weakly through the branches, casting long, wavering shadows upon the glistening undergrowth. The figure suspended from the branch swung slightly, the rope creaking ominously with every movement of the wind. It was a scene of deliberate horror, calculated to shock and terrify. Poirot approached, his movements deliberate and measured. Miss Vale clutched at his arm, pale and trembling. Monsieur Poirot, is he? Sure, mademoiselle. Observe, but do not panic, Poirot said gently. We must see the facts as they are. Panic distorts perception. Calm, order, logic, these reveal the truth. It was then that they noticed the figure's identity. A man, yes, but not the Colonel. The victim was Gerald Marston, a wealthy industrialist and a guest of the lodge, whose inclusion in this gathering had seemed innocuous until now. His lifeless form was suspended by a thick rope tied expertly around a branch, his feet barely grazing the leaf-strewn ground. A crimson ribbon, the same Poirot had noticed earlier, was caught in the folds of his coat, fluttering like a signal in the stillness. Poirot knelt to examine the scene. Every detail mattered. The angle of the rope, the orientation of the body, the footprints leading both toward and away from the tree. He noted the disturbed soil beneath the oak, indicating that the victim had been placed there rather than having climbed on his own, a staged execution designed to shock. "See, mademoiselle," Poirot murmured, "a mind of great cunning has acted here." The killer sought not merely to end a life, but to frighten, to send a message. Note the precision, the body is displayed like a tableau, a theatre of cruelty. Miss Vale shivered, drawing her coat tighter. But who could have done this? Everyone was in the lodge, weren't they? "Ah, mademoiselle," Poirot said, "appearances deceive. One can be present, yet absent. A mind that plans such a crime leaves little to chance. Let us examine the clues." The first was the footprints. Poirot traced them in the mud with a slender gloved finger. "Observe, there are two distinct sets. One, large, heavy, deep in the mud. Likely a man of some strength. The other, lighter, almost delicate. Notice the spacing, quick steps outward, slower return. This suggests haste at first, then careful retreat." He then examined the rope, noting the type of knot. "Ah, an experienced hand. Not the work of an amateur. The knot is secure, methodical, perhaps military training, perhaps someone accustomed to physical work, yet with an eye for detail." Poirot's eyes shifted to the surrounding forest. Broken twigs, faint impressions in the moss, and a small scrap of parchment partially buried under wet leaves. He picked it up with great care. The paper bore a symbol, roughly drawn, a circle intersected by a jagged line. "A mark," Poirot whispered, "meant to frighten, to confuse. Or perhaps a signature of the killer. Symbolism, very deliberate. Note, mademoiselle, the mind that works in symbols is a mind that plans far ahead." The guests had gathered at the edge of the clearing, murmuring in frightened groups. Colonel Redmayne's face was pale, his hands clenched. "Who could commit such a thing? In my lodge? Under my protection?" he demanded, his voice taut with anger and fear. Poirot turned, small eyes sharp and calculating. "Colonel, this was not random. The selection of Mr. Marston as the victim is purposeful. He, of all your guests, held a secret, perhaps old debts, perhaps rivalry, perhaps a grievance hidden behind polite conversation. The killer chose carefully." Mrs. Linton, notebook in hand, leaned forward. "Monsieur Poirot, I saw someone near the lodge before the scream. I thought it was the fog playing tricks, but—" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Indeed. Fog, shadow, and imagination often confuse the untrained eye. But the observant, like you, mademoiselle, note the subtle truths. Describe what you saw." "A figure," she said slowly, "slender, wearing dark clothes. It moved quickly, almost silently. I thought it had vanished into the trees, and then the scream came." Poirot nodded. "Ah, silent movement, stealth, a calculated escape. And see this, mademoiselle." He gestured to the faint trail of footprints leading into the denser part of the woods. The perpetrator retraced their steps, avoiding the main paths, perhaps to confuse pursuit. The mind that does this is careful, intelligent, patient. Dr. Haldane, who had been examining the body clinically, stepped closer. The strangulation appears to have been sudden but deliberate. There is no evidence of a struggle, yet the victim's hands are slightly bruised. Perhaps caught off guard, or surprised by the attacker's strength. Poirot considered the doctor with a small nod. "Excellent observation. Indeed, surprise is a weapon of choice for the cunning. Yet note, the body was displayed. The horror was part of the plan. Not merely murder, but psychological theatre." The colonel's voice was sharp. "So, you think one of us here did this?" Poirot's lips curved in a faint, deliberate smile. "Colonel, the circle of suspects is rarely as broad as the imagination supposes. The hand that plans such a tableau is often close. Familiarity provides opportunity. The forest itself offers concealment, yes, but also insight, footprints. Broken twigs, the discarded ribbon. These speak, if one knows how to listen. Poirot turned toward Miss Vale. Mademoiselle, you see now why your fears brought me here. Danger exists in Wynthorpe Woods, yes. But not from the trees, not from shadows alone. From human minds, and their hidden motives, danger arises. And those minds are clever, patient, and willing to deceive. He rose and surveyed the clearing once more. The fog clung to the ground, the trees swayed in the light wind, and the scattered leaves glistened like wet jewels. Every detail, every irregularity, every subtle mark would be filed away in his extraordinary memory. Poirot spoke quietly, almost to himself. Ah, the human heart, complex, dark, and often cruel. But it leaves traces, always traces. Footprints, signs of effort, misjudged hiding places. And the cleverest, the most meticulous, can be discovered, if one knows where to look. As the guests murmured anxiously, Poirot's gaze shifted toward the deeper forest, toward the areas shrouded in mist. Somewhere, perhaps, the murderer was already watching, observing the reaction, gauging the chaos, anticipating the next move. Poirot did not flinch. Patience, observation, method, all shall reveal the truth. That is the way of Hercule Poirot. The forest seemed to listen, silent and watchful, as if aware that a game far more intricate than mere hunting had begun. And within the lodge, backlit by fading light and the gathering shadows, Poirot's mind worked, meticulously piecing together fragments, searching for a pattern, hunting the invisible hand that had orchestrated this chilling tableau. By the time they returned to the lodge, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest a dark, brooding mass. Poirot's small figure led the way, each step measured, each thought precise. The first move in a deadly game had been made, and the game, he knew, had only just begun. Chapter 4 of The Lodge of Secrets. The lodge was quiet when the party returned from the forest, but a different sort of silence now pervaded its grand, shadowed halls. The storm had passed, leaving behind a chill dampness, and every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the tall windows, seemed amplified. The guests moved about with an air of unease, their conversation subdued, as if the events in the clearing had stripped them of their composure. Poirot, however, remained composed, his mind alert and his eyes sharp. He had seen many murders, many carefully staged deceptions, but the intricacy of this crime, the terror intended in its execution, suggested a cunning mind indeed. And minds of that caliber often left more than they realized. He began his investigation in the clearing itself, now revisited in the pale glow of lamplight from the lodge. With a handkerchief, he carefully collected the crimson ribbon, noting its faint traces of soil and moisture. Curious, he murmured. It has been torn, perhaps by accident, or perhaps to leave a subtle clue. Whoever did this is both careless and meticulous, a rare combination. Colonel Redmayne, standing nearby, folded his arms. Surely you do not intend to suggest that one of my guests could commit such an atrocity? Poirot inclined his head gracefully. Colonel, I suggest only that the perpetrator is close, familiar with both the lodge and the people within it. The opportunity is as important as motive, yes, but opportunity alone is insufficient. The mind, the calculation, the patience, these are the true hallmarks of the criminal. The colonel's gaze hardened, but he said nothing. Poirot moved inside the lodge, guiding Miss Vale and a few of the other guests into the drawing room. The room, large and dimly lit by a central chandelier, exuded an atmosphere of old wealth and quiet severity. Heavy curtains were drawn, shielding the interior from the darkening forest. The walls, lined with dark wooden panels and family portraits, seemed to observe them silently. Poirot gestured to the group. Mademoiselle Vale, Mrs. Linton, Dr. Haldane, Major Evers, I would ask each of you to recount, calmly and precisely, your actions during the afternoon. Begin from the moment breakfast ended. Let us assemble a timeline. Memory, unhurried, reveals what panic obscures. Miss Vale spoke first, her voice tentative. After breakfast, I walked toward the veranda to gather my thoughts. I watched the forest, the mist, then I returned to the clearing briefly to observe the guests during their demonstration. That was when I saw a figure moving among the trees. Then, the scream. Poirot nodded, noting her every word with his usual precision. And the figure, mademoiselle? Describe fully. It was tall, slender, moving with remarkable stealth. I cannot say more. Ah, but that is enough, Poirot said gently. We shall examine this further. Thank you. Mrs. Linton spoke next. I was sketching the clearing, attempting to capture the mood for my work. I did not approach the trees, but I saw the same figure, or what I thought was a figure, disappearing among the mist. Poirot's small eyes glimmered. Yes, mademoiselle. Consistent observation is a fine tool. The eyes notice more than the mind admits. And Dr. Haldane. The doctor cleared his throat. I walked near the path that leads to the old oak. I thought the fog was playing tricks, but there were footprints in the mud, fresh ones, leading toward the clearing and away again. I examined the body briefly, yes, but did not touch anything else. Excellent, Poirot said, his fingers steepled. And Major Evers? I was keeping watch near the perimeter, the soldier said, his voice low. I saw nothing until the scream. By the time I reached the clearing, it was too late. Poirot regarded them all. Very well. We have a general picture. But now, attention to detail. Let us consider the lodge itself. The crime was executed outside, yes, but the killer had access to information about the movements of each guest. They knew when to act, how to strike, and how to vanish. That is no mere chance. He moved toward the mantelpiece, studying the objects displayed there: a silver clock, a pair of crystal candlesticks, and a set of family photographs. One photograph, slightly askew, caught his eye. It depicted Colonel Redmayne, younger, in uniform, standing alongside a group of men, including one who bore a striking resemblance to Gerald Marston, the victim. Poirot's finger traced the outline. Ah, old connections, old enmities. This may prove significant. Poirot's attention then shifted to the windows. He noted small scratches on the sill, as if someone had pressed against it. The perpetrator may have surveyed the clearing from within. Not all courage is found in the open. As evening deepened, Poirot invited the guests to remain in the drawing room. He wanted them observed, to study reactions, small gestures, the interplay of nerves and conscience. The human face, he said softly, reveals what words conceal. Anxiety is a language all its own. Over tea, he began questioning gently, casually at first, moving from one topic to another, watching how each answered. Mrs. Linton's fingers trembled slightly when discussing Mr. Marston. Dr. Haldane's gaze lingered too long on the window. Major Evers' posture stiffened, rigid as a soldier should be, yet betraying tension. And Miss Vale, she remained fragile, yet observant, clutching her handkerchief, listening intently to every exchange. Poirot's thoughts wandered briefly to the earlier discoveries in the forest. The footprints, the ribbon, the knot in the rope, the faint symbol on the scrap of parchment, all pieces of a larger puzzle. Each was a message left, deliberate or accidental, by a mind confident in its cunning. And yet, Poirot knew, even the most careful mind leaves something behind. A gesture, a glance, a word, all betray the criminal. The colonel, meanwhile, had retired to his study, muttering about the need to contact the authorities. Poirot allowed him to go, noting that the Colonel's distance and control over the household could be both obstacle and advantage. Poirot returned to the guests, his voice quiet but firm. "We must consider motives. Wealth, pride, jealousy, revenge, all are possible. But more subtle motives often hide behind appearances. Old grievances, unspoken slights, perhaps secrets too delicate to voice openly. The mind that acts with foresight leaves no trace except where it miscalculates. And every miscalculation is a clue." He paused, scanning the room. "Tonight, we shall remain vigilant. Each word, each glance, each gesture is significant. The forest has already spoken in terror. Inside, within these walls, we may learn more." As the night drew on, the lodge settled into uneasy quiet. Shadows flickered from the fireplace, twisting across the walls, blending with the darkness creeping from the forest. Poirot moved from guest to guest, observing, questioning, yet never alarming. His presence was a calm center amidst growing tension. Later, he returned to the veranda alone, peering into the misty forest beyond. Somewhere within those trees, the murderer lurked, confident in their concealment. And yet, Poirot knew, concealment is never complete. Every act of violence, every deception, leaves a trail. One must only possess the patience, the observation, and the insight to follow it. "The forest hides many things," he murmured to himself, "but no secret can escape forever. Patience, method, and the little grey cells, these shall reveal all." And deep in the woods, a shadow seemed to pause, as if sensing that the game had changed. The first threads of truth were being drawn together, and Hercule Poirot, calm and exacting, was already beginning to unravel the tangled web that bound Wynthorpe Lodge and its guests. Chapter 5: Shadows of the Past. The morning following the horrific discovery of Gerald Marston's body, Wynthorpe Lodge was suffused with an uneasy stillness. The storm had cleared, leaving behind a pale sun that struggled to pierce the mist curling around the towering trees of the surrounding woods. Yet the atmosphere inside the lodge was heavy with tension, for the shadow of death lingered, coloring every glance and conversation. Poirot, however, moved through the house with calm purpose. He had observed much since his arrival, gestures, glances, the subtle tremor in a hand when a certain subject arose. Now, he intended to delve deeper, to unravel the threads of history that tied the guests to the victim, and perhaps, to the killer. He summoned the remaining guests to the drawing room, where the fire burned low, casting long, wavering shadows across the polished wood. Colonel Redmayne, though outwardly composed, exhibited a restless energy, pacing occasionally, rubbing his hands together. Miss Vale sat close to the fire, clutching a thick woolen shawl, her eyes wide and alert. The others had gathered in cautious circles, some seated, some standing, all aware that Poirot's small, penetrating gaze would leave no detail unnoticed. "Before we proceed further," Poirot began, his voice soft but commanding, "we must understand the past. Often, the roots of a crime lie not in the present, but in what has been hidden, ignored, or forgotten." Mrs. Linton, the novelist, leaned forward. "You mean old grudges?" "Precisely, mademoiselle. Old wounds, resentments, jealousies, unspoken quarrels. All leave traces, subtle and sometimes invisible, yet they influence actions profoundly." Poirot moved to a side table where the guests' personal effects had been placed after the discovery of the body. "Let us consider each of you in the context of history. Old connections, past grievances, and opportunities are as important as any physical evidence." He began with Dr. Haldane, whose calm exterior was now slightly frayed. "Doctor, you have known Mr. Marston for some years, have you not?" The doctor nodded reluctantly. "Yes, monsieur. We met through mutual acquaintances in London. Our families were friendly, and our business dealings, though minor, sometimes crossed paths." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And any disagreements, conflicts of interest, disputes over money or influence. Dr. Haldane hesitated. There were disagreements, yes. Minor. Nothing serious. Ah, Poirot murmured. Minor disagreements, repeated over years, can become seeds of great resentment. One plants a garden of minor slights, and sometimes it yields poisonous fruit. Poirot then turned to Major Evers. And you, Major? Your history with the Colonel and Mr. Marston, how long have you known them? Since the army, monsieur. We served together decades ago, Evers replied, his voice steady but guarded. I left the service some years ago. We were friends, comrades in arms, nothing more. Poirot's eyes flicked to the Colonel. Ah, but friendship in the army is a curious thing, yes? Bonds formed under fire, but also jealousy, rivalry, envy. And some grudges never die. The Colonel stiffened. We were all men of honor. There was no jealousy, no malice. Poirot inclined his head politely. Of course, Colonel. And yet, the past often has a life of its own, independent of our assurances. Now, Mademoiselle Vale, you have lived here for many years with your guardian. You have seen interactions among these guests before, perhaps observed tensions. Miss Vale's lips pressed together. I have noticed subtle things. Mr. Marston and Major Evers often exchanged glances I did not understand. Dr. Haldane occasionally spoke in hushed tones with the Colonel, and there was talk of a business venture that went wrong many years ago. I never thought it important. Poirot's fingers pressed together. Ah, Mademoiselle, it is always the small, seemingly trivial details that reveal the true pattern. Hushed conversations, lingering glances, minor quarrels, these are the threads with which a murderer weaves a plan. He walked to the mantelpiece and examined a small photograph of the Colonel in uniform, standing alongside a group of men, including a younger Gerald Marston. Notice, guests, the posture, the expressions. Even in old photographs, one can detect hierarchy, tension, ambition, perhaps rivalry. Poirot's attention then shifted to the personal belongings of the victim. A wallet, a watch, and a small leather-bound journal lay neatly on the table. He opened the journal carefully. Its pages contained meticulous notes about past business dealings, private correspondences, and observations about the Colonel and other guests. There were references to a failed expedition, a lost fortune, and an old debt that had never been repaid. Ah, Poirot murmured, here we have seeds of motive. Financial dealings, failed ventures, debts unpaid, and all intertwined with personal histories. Monsieur Marston, though prosperous now, carried the weight of old conflicts. And someone here clearly bore resentment, enough to plan this horror. Mrs. Linton shifted in her seat. You think it was revenge? Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, Mademoiselle. But revenge is rarely spontaneous. It is calculated. Planned. Every detail of this murder, the timing, the location, the manner of display, speaks of deliberation. The killer sought to frighten, perhaps even to communicate something, rather than merely kill. He returned to Miss Vale. Mademoiselle, you have lived in this household and observed the interactions here. Can you think of anyone who might hold such a grudge? Someone patient, intelligent, capable of careful planning. Miss Vale's brow furrowed. I cannot say for certain. But there is Dr. Haldane. He has always been secretive. He knows things the rest of us do not. Poirot nodded slightly, but his expression remained neutral. Observation, Mademoiselle, must be coupled with proof. Suspicions alone do not solve a crime. Yet your words are useful, they suggest lines of inquiry to pursue. He then asked the guests to recount more specifically their actions during the previous day, each in turn, pressing gently for details of interactions with Mr. Marston and any observations that might have seemed insignificant at the time. Subtle contradictions began to emerge. Dr. Haldane had claimed to be walking alone near the edge of the forest at the time of the scream, yet Major Evers had seen him briefly in the library. Miss Vale admitted to having glimpsed someone moving near the trees just before the scream, but could not identify the figure. Mrs. Linton's account of her sketches also conflicted in minor ways with the timeline of the others. Poirot leaned back, fingers steepled once more, eyes narrowed. Ah, the human memory is fallible. But from contradictions, patterns emerge. We must examine not only what was done, but why, the motive, the opportunity, and the mind behind the act. He then considered the lodge itself. Old letters, diaries, photographs, and ledgers all hinted at secrets buried within these walls. One particular envelope, yellowed with age and unsealed, contained correspondence between the Colonel and Mr. Marston's father, discussing a failed expedition abroad, a sum of money unreturned, and a perceived betrayal that had left wounds deep enough to fester over decades. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, here we see the origins of resentment. A debt, a betrayal, old grievances carefully hidden, and now, a life taken in the forest, staged with terror to convey a message. The killer is patient, methodical, and cunning. The guests, sensing Poirot's intensity, fell silent. Even Colonel Redmayne's usual composure was strained. Poirot's gaze swept the room, catching every tremor, every flicker of emotion. The forest outside, though quiet now, seemed to echo the tension inside, a mirror to the unspoken conflicts and shadowed motives. Finally, Poirot spoke softly, decisively. Tonight, we will rest, but tomorrow, we shall continue our examination. Each of you, your histories, your relationships, your past interactions with Mr. Marston, all are pieces of a puzzle. And every piece, however small, must be considered. The shadows of the past have entered this house, and only by illuminating them will the truth emerge. As the guests retired to their rooms, the lodge seemed to settle into a tense, watchful silence. Poirot remained by the window, gazing into the misty woods. Somewhere, hidden among the trees or perhaps cloaked in secrecy within the lodge itself, the murderer awaited, confident in their concealment. Poirot, small and precise, allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Patience, he murmured to himself. Observation. Little grey cells. Every secret leaves a trace. And even in the shadows of the past, justice can be found. And with that, he turned from the window, already planning his next steps in the careful unraveling of a mystery that was far from complete. Chapter 6. The Trap in the Woods. The following evening, Wynthorpe Lodge seemed to thrum with a nervous energy, as if the house itself anticipated the unfolding of events. Poirot, ever the orchestrator of order from chaos, had spent the day reviewing every minute detail he had gathered, the footprints in the forest, the crimson ribbon, the torn letters, the inconsistencies in alibis, and the subtle reactions of each guest. He had formed a plan, a subtle trap, designed not with force, but with the precision of the mind, to unmask the killer through fear and observation. The mist rolled thickly over the forest as the guests gathered in the drawing-room for tea. Poirot, calm and deliberate, moved among them with his usual elegance, observing gestures, expressions, and the tiny tremors that betrayed inner turmoil. Colonel Redmayne, Poirot said, breaking the low murmur of conversation, I have been reflecting upon the events in the forest, and I propose a precaution. Tomorrow, we shall walk once more in the woods, together. But we will do so under controlled conditions. No one will be left alone. Every action, every movement, will be observed. The Colonel nodded reluctantly. Very well, Poirot. But surely you exaggerate the danger. Poirot smiled faintly. Danger is often in the mind, yes, Colonel. Yet a mind of cunning can act boldly, especially when it believes itself undetected. We must ensure that no opportunity exists for mischief. Miss Vale looked uneasy. "Do you think the murderer will strike again, monsieur?" "Perhaps, mademoiselle. And perhaps they already have in mind their next move. That is why observation is essential. And, in truth, we must apply a subtle strategy, not force, but psychology." He instructed that lanterns be taken along the paths, that every step be audible, that the guests remain in pairs. Yet Poirot insisted that he walk alone at intervals, deliberately allowing glimpses of himself disappearing into the mist. This, he explained, would test reactions, revealing whose nerves were steady and whose might betray guilt. As evening fell, the group set out. The forest was dense, the mist curling around gnarled roots and branches like living fingers. The air was thick with moisture, carrying the scent of wet leaves and moss. Every footfall was careful, measured, yet Poirot noted subtle disturbances in the undergrowth, footprints, displaced twigs, traces of movement not accounted for by any guest. Poirot paused near a fork in the path, observing closely. The Colonel and Miss Vale had moved ahead, engaged in quiet conversation. Mrs. Linton and Dr. Haldane followed a few paces behind, while Major Evans lingered near the rear. Poirot bent slightly, examining the soil. Two sets of footprints diverged from the main path, one deep, broad, and deliberate, the other lighter, almost cautious. "Interesting," Poirot murmured under his breath. The killer tests the ground, perhaps retracing steps, perhaps confident of control. Suddenly, a rustling in the underbrush made Miss Vale start. Her hand tightened around Poirot's arm. "Monsieur, did you hear that?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Yes, mademoiselle." A subtle movement, too careful to be accidental. Someone among us tests reactions, watches for fear. Very clever. But observe, I am calm. Calmness is a shield. They continued slowly, the lanterns casting tall, flickering shadows that danced across the trees. Poirot made a point of positioning himself at the edge of visibility, occasionally vanishing into the mist, allowing the guests to perceive him as distant, yet unseen. Each reaction was catalogued in his mind, Dr. Haldane's tight grip on his walking stick, Mrs. Linton's nervous glance toward a shadowy grove, Major Evans' rigid posture. Poirot chose a clearing that lay deeper within the woods, a place near the ancient oak where Marston had been killed. Here, he stopped and gestured for the group to assemble. "Now, mademoiselle, gentlemen, observe closely. The killer's mind is methodical. We must watch, wait, and provoke only enough to reveal reaction, not to incite panic." He instructed the group to remain together while he simulated a brief disappearance, slipping silently behind a thicket. The rustle of his movement, the faint sound of boots on undergrowth, created tension. He allowed enough time for nerves to fray, for subtle reactions to manifest. A shadow detached itself from the mist. A figure moved with a cautious, measured tread, glancing in every direction. Poirot's keen eyes registered the motion immediately. The figure paused, seemingly uncertain, then retreated, slipping toward the thicker forest. Poirot emerged calmly from behind the thicket. "Ah," he said softly, "there we have proof that someone desires solitude, yet cannot resist observing. Fear is a tool, and observation is a weapon. Both have revealed the hand we seek." Miss Vale looked wide-eyed. "Do you mean the murderer?" "Yes, mademoiselle. Someone here tests our movements, gauges our vigilance, and yet betrays caution. Observe the footprints, careful, yet retracing. Observe the mind, confident, yet uneasy. These are signs of guilt." Colonel Redmayne frowned. "But who could it be? We have all been careful." Poirot's gaze swept the group with unerring precision. "Ah, Colonel, carelessness is often hidden, even from oneself. Subtle hesitation, the tightening of the jaw, the twitch of a hand, these are not easily controlled under stress. he called the guests closer to a small stone clearing. "We shall examine a little further." This was the spot where Mr. Marston fell. Notice the disturbed ground, the marks of a struggle, and the placement of the rope. Someone intended to stage terror. But even terror leaves traces. And we shall follow these traces. Poirot knelt to study the earth, noting small scratches and depressions. "Ah, yes, see here?" The killer moved with care, yet in haste, leaving small errors. That is a key to the mind. They are intelligent, yes, but perhaps too self-assured. Pride often leads to exposure. Mrs. Linton whispered, "Do you think the killer will strike again tonight?" Poirot shook his head. "Patience, mademoiselle. The trap is set. Our movements, our watchfulness, and the psychology of fear will guide them into revealing themselves. One does not need force, one only needs subtle manipulation." Hours passed, the forest a tableau of mist and shadow. Poirot moved discreetly, allowing the guests to perceive him, retreating into the fog, then reappearing. Minor sounds, a branch snapping, a rustle of leaves, tested reactions. Slowly, patterns emerged. Dr. Haldane flinched slightly at every unexpected noise. Mrs. Linton's gaze flicked repeatedly toward one particular thicket. Major Evers maintained composure but betrayed slight hesitation in his steps. Poirot finally gathered them in the clearing once more. "Ah, Miss Amos," he said softly, "the mind of a criminal is never silent. It whispers in gestures, in reactions, in fear. The trap we set is simple: observe, note, and wait. Fear reveals more than interrogation ever could." Miss Vale shivered, holding close to the colonel. "It is terrifying, monsieur. This forest feels alive with secrets." "Yes, mademoiselle," Poirot said, his small eyes gleaming, "but secrets are not eternal. Patience, observation, and the little grey cells will uncover all. And tomorrow, we shall have more evidence, more insight, and perhaps the first true step toward justice." As the group returned to the lodge, the forest seemed to exhale, as if momentarily satisfied. Yet Poirot, walking with deliberate calm, knew that the game was far from over. Somewhere among them, cloaked in the shadows of the trees and the fears of the night, the murderer plotted their next move, unaware that the greatest trap of all had already been set, invisible, psychological, and perfectly designed. Poirot paused for a moment at the lodge door, gazing into the misty depths of the woods. Patience, precision, observation, soon the mind that planned horror will betray itself. And I shall be ready. Chapter 7: The Gathering of Suspects. The following evening, Wynthorpe Lodge was tense in a way that could almost be felt as a physical weight. The earlier storm had cleared entirely, leaving the night crisp and sharp, the moon rising pale over the dark expanse of Wynthorpe Woods. Inside the lodge, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, for Hercule Poirot had called a meeting of all remaining guests and the colonel himself. The fire burned brightly in the drawing room, casting long shadows across the polished floor and the portraits that lined the walls. Poirot, small, precise, and unruffled as ever, moved to the center of the room. His eyes, keen and unwavering, swept over the assembled party: Colonel Redmayne, his expression taut but composed; Miss Vale, pale but attentive; Mrs. Linton, the novelist, notebook in hand; Dr. Haldane, calm yet visibly alert; and Major Evers, standing rigidly near the fireplace. Each was aware that tonight, the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot would probe not only the crime, but the truths and secrets that lurked in every heart. "Miss Amos," Poirot began, his tone soft yet commanding attention, "tonight we gather not merely to discuss a murder, but to illuminate the shadows that hide in plain sight. The forest has spoken in terror, yes, but the truth lies not only in what the eyes see, but in what the mind observes." He gestured toward the fireplace, then slowly moved to a side table where the collected personal effects of the victim lay: the journal, the wallet, the crimson ribbon, and the scrap of parchment with the mysterious symbol. Here are the traces left by the hand that struck Mr. Marston. Each tells a story, if one knows how to read it. Poirot began with the timeline. After breakfast yesterday, each of you moved about the lodge and the grounds. Some observed the forest, some spoke with one another, some, perhaps, sought opportunity. All of you have recounted your movements. Yet, upon examination, there are discrepancies. Contradictions, subtle though they may be, that betray more than mere forgetfulness. He paused and fixed his small, piercing gaze on Dr. Haldane. Doctor, you stated that you were walking near the edge of the forest alone. Yet Major Evers observed you in the library at the same time. Explain. Dr. Haldane's eyes flickered, and he shifted slightly. I must have misjudged the time, monsieur. I moved from the library to the path, yes, that is all. Poirot's lips curved into a faint, precise smile. Ah, a small error. Yet even small errors, repeated under scrutiny, illuminate the path to truth. Observation, Doctor, is relentless. The mind cannot entirely conceal itself. He turned to Mrs. Linton. Mademoiselle, your sketches of the clearing were done with care. Yet the timing you provided conflicts with Miss Vale's account of seeing a figure in the trees. Who was that figure? Mrs. Linton hesitated. I did not see clearly. The mist was thick, it could have been anyone. Ah, Poirot said, the mist is convenient for hiding faces, yes, but less convenient for hiding actions. The killer relies upon obscurity, but cannot entirely control it. That is why we observe. He moved slowly around the room, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze flicking from guest to guest. We know this, the murder was deliberate, staged with care, and intended to terrify. The rope, the display beneath the oak, the selection of Mr. Marston, all point to planning and motive. But the question remains, what drove this act? What old grievance, what unspoken resentment, what shadow of the past demanded such action? Poirot paused beside the fireplace and gestured to the photograph of Colonel Redmayne in uniform, alongside a younger Marston. The past speaks. Old expeditions, failed ventures, debts unpaid, all are seeds of resentment. But not all who bear resentment act with such calculated cruelty. One must consider intelligence, opportunity, and temperament. Miss Vale spoke softly, almost in a whisper. Monsieur Poirot, I noticed there was something strange about Dr. Haldane yesterday. He seemed anxious. Observing us more than the forest. Poirot nodded slightly. Observation under stress reveals truth. But it is not only anxiety that matters, it is the pattern, the repetition, the subtle gestures that betray intent. He then turned to the Colonel. Colonel Redmayne, you have lived in this house long enough to know its inhabitants intimately. Yet yesterday, you permitted a gathering in the forest, an event that led to death. Can you deny that familiarity, oversight, and perhaps pride, all played a part in what followed? The Colonel's jaw tightened. I am responsible for the safety of my guests, Poirot. That is true. But I did not commit this crime. I trusted them. Poirot inclined his head. Trust, Colonel, is often misplaced. And the clever mind relies upon that trust to act unseen. But no trust can conceal the truth from observation. Even here, inside these walls, gestures, glances, and the tiniest hesitation reveal the mind's secrets. He moved toward the table again, picking up the scrap of parchment with the strange symbol. This mark, Poirot said, was left deliberately, perhaps as a signature. A clue, yes, but also a psychological weapon meant to confuse, intimidate, and mislead. Yet it is revealing in its very nature, for a mind clever enough to leave such a mark also leaves subtle inconsistencies elsewhere. Poirot then addressed the group as a whole. We have seen the footprints, the rope, the ribbon, and the symbol. We have noted contradictions in accounts, anxiety in gestures, and subtle miscalculations in timing. All point toward the mind of a meticulous, patient, and clever criminal, someone with intelligence, opportunity, and motive intertwined with the past. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The room was silent save for the faint crackle of the fire. Poirot's gaze swept from guest to guest, noting each reaction, each tremor of unease, and each involuntary movement. Now, he continued, his voice calm yet filled with authority, we shall play a little more. I will not accuse blindly. That is not the way of logic. But I will test reactions, provoke truths, and observe with precision. Some truths are hidden even from oneself until a subtle pressure reveals them. Tonight, we shall see who bears that pressure most heavily. Miss Vale's hands trembled slightly as she held her shawl tighter. Mrs. Linton's eyes darted from Poirot to the others, as if she feared detection. Dr. Haldane maintained his calm exterior, yet the subtle tightening of his lips betrayed unease. Major Ever's posture remained rigid, yet a fleeting glance toward a corner of the room revealed a flicker of apprehension. Even Colonel Redmayne, though outwardly composed, seemed aware that the investigator's small, deliberate movements were a scalpel, dissecting his mind and the minds of those around him. Poirot's small voice softened, yet carried unmistakably. Tomorrow, the forest shall witness another gathering, not for leisure, but for observation. And when the time comes, one mind will reveal itself, whether through fear, through guilt, or through the subtle errors that even intelligence cannot wholly conceal. The little grey cells, Miss Amos, see what eyes alone cannot. The guests, silent and tense, absorbed the weight of his words. Outside, the mist swirled against the windows, blending with the shadows, as if the forest itself held its breath in anticipation. Within the lodge, every heart seemed to beat in careful measure, aware that the investigator's gaze penetrated deeper than any human eye could reach. Poirot allowed the moment to linger, then spoke softly, with a faint smile. The night may be long, and shadows many, but fear, anxiety, and inconsistency have a language of their own. And that language shall speak, revealing the hand that has wrought death and terror in Wynthorpe Woods. Patience, observation, method, these are our allies. And tomorrow, the truth shall begin to take shape. As the guests retired for the night, their thoughts troubled and restless, Poirot remained by the window, gazing into the misty forest. Somewhere within that dense expanse of trees, the mind of the murderer waited, confident in its concealment. Yet Poirot knew, with the certainty of his meticulous intellect, that concealment is never absolute, and that every deception, however cunning, leaves a trace. The trap was set. The stage prepared. And by the morning, the shadows would begin to reveal their secrets. Chapter 8, The Little Grey Cells Reveal All. The dawn broke pale over Wynthorpe Lodge, the mist still clinging to the edges of the forest, twisting through the gnarled branches like spirits reluctant to depart. Inside the drawing room, Hercule Poirot stood by the fireplace, small, exact, and perfectly composed, his eyes gleaming with quiet certainty. The guests had been summoned once more, each aware that today the veil of mystery would be lifted. The air was thick with tension, a charged silence that magnified every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of shadow cast by the rising sun. Poirot addressed the assembly with his usual precision. Miss Amos, the events of the past days have revealed much, yet much remains unspoken. The forest, the clearing, the rope, the ribbon, the mysterious symbol, each was placed carefully, each was meant to convey a message. And yet, the mind behind these acts has left the smallest of errors, subtle, perhaps, but unmistakable to one trained in observation. He motioned for them to sit, and the guests obeyed, their expressions taut with anticipation. Even Colonel Redmayne, a man accustomed to authority, was silent, fingers clasped tightly, eyes fixed upon the detective. Poirot began with the physical evidence. We have the rope, tied with expert skill, the crimson ribbon torn and displaced, and the scrap of parchment bearing a symbol. All these speak to intelligence, patience, and deliberate planning. But consider the footprints, 2 sets, one large, one small. Both retrace steps, indicating caution. Yet the lighter prints, while careful, displayed subtle hesitation near the edge of the clearing, hesitation born of fear and conscience. He moved to the table, picking up the ribbon with gloved fingers. Ah, yes. The ribbon, torn not in haste, but as an afterthought. The killer intended it to be a dramatic device, yet underestimated the permanence of soil and moisture. Every element left behind is a whisper from the mind that acted. Poirot's gaze swept across the room. We must consider motive. Mr. Marston, wealthy and influential, yet carrying old debts, old grievances, and old connections with each of you. Dr. Haldane, long associated with the family, with knowledge of past failures and entanglements. Major Evers, friend and former comrade in arms, whose pride and reputation might have been wounded by history. Colonel Redmayne, custodian of the lodge and arbiter of its guests. Mrs. Linton, keen observer, though perhaps not implicated. And Mademoiselle Vale, perceptive and attentive, yet without motive. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. The little grey cells, Miss Amos, work best when the mind is patient, methodical, and observant. And now, through observation, questioning, and the subtle trap set in the forest, the truth has been revealed, in gestures, in hesitation, and in errors too small for ordinary eyes to detect. Poirot's small fingers rested on the arm of a chair as he began to unravel the narrative. Yesterday, I noted Dr. Haldane's nervous glances toward the thickets, his subtle tightening of the lips, and his over-attentiveness to the reactions of others. These are hallmarks of a guilty conscience. But more, the contradictions in his account, the discrepancies in the timeline, the slight misjudgments of his own movements, all reveal the hand behind the act. He fixed the doctor with a quiet intensity. Doctor, you intended to stage a murder that would terrify, that would appear as an act of vengeance drawn from the shadows of history. Yet your careful planning was undermined by your own anxiety, and by the subtle observations of others. You misjudged the timing, miscalculated reactions, and, most critically, left a mark that could be traced to your intellect and your hand. Dr. Haldane's lips pressed together, his calm facade beginning to crumble. I did what I had to do. He threatened to ruin everything, to expose past mistakes, betray confidences. Poirot nodded. Yes, Doctor. Mr. Marston's knowledge of past financial entanglements and his awareness of the failed expedition abroad gave you motive. Your fear of exposure, your desire to protect your reputation and investments, drove you to act. Yet fear, combined with intelligence, is often predictable. And the little grey cells, Miss Amos, perceive predictability. He then explained the final pieces of the puzzle. The rope was tied expertly because you had learned knots in your youth, a skill from your medical expeditions in foreign lands. The ribbon, torn accidentally, was meant to dramatize the scene, to create the impression of chaos where none truly existed. And the symbol, that circle with the jagged line, a misdirection, a psychological signature, meant to confuse. Yet in its very intricacy, it reflected your mind, Doctor. Every complexity hides simplicity, every deception reveals truth. Poirot's gaze swept the room again. And the forest test we performed last night, the careful observation of reactions. Dr. Haldane, your nervous hesitation, your calculated retreat behind the mist, betrayed that you anticipated further surveillance. That is why the trap worked. The mind that fears detection cannot entirely conceal itself. The doctor's hands trembled slightly. I did not intend to kill so brutally. I only wanted to frighten him. But fright can become murder when the mind is clouded by desperation, Doctor. And desperation, coupled with planning, is the most dangerous combination of all. Poirot then addressed the other guests. As for the rest of you, note the distinction between observation and involvement. Some watched, Some noticed, some feared, but none participated. The guilt lies with one mind alone, one mind both clever and reckless, patient yet fallible. Dr. Haldane, it is yours. Miss Vale's eyes widened, and she clasped her hands. I knew it. The way he acted in the woods, it never felt natural. Mrs. Linton nodded slowly. And the subtle errors, the hesitation when he thought no one was watching. Now it all makes sense. Poirot's small form straightened, hands clasped. Observe, Miss Amis, how the human mind betrays itself in the smallest of actions. Observation, patience, and method reveal all that the eyes alone cannot see. The little grey cells, diligently applied, have reconstructed the events, revealed motives, and identified the hand that acted. He turned to the Colonel. Colonel Redmayne, the past and present intertwine. This is a cautionary tale that even within the walls of one's own home, vigilance must be maintained. Trust, though a virtue, must be paired with careful observation. Poirot then offered a final reflection, his tone softening, almost philosophical. Murder, Miss Amis, is an act of human frailty and fear. Yet justice, guided by method and logic, restores order. The fear created by the act, the terror staged in the forest, the psychological drama, all are undone by the application of reason and the careful observation of human behavior. Dr. Haldane, pale and shaken, sank into a chair. I understand, Poirot. I miscalculated. I thought my planning flawless. Poirot's gaze was gentle but firm. Monsieur, planning without observation of the smallest details is never flawless. Even the most intelligent mind leaves a trace. That is the lesson, and the tool of justice. Miss Vale, her voice small, spoke, Monsieur Poirot, how did you know so much? The way he hid, the small errors, the gestures. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, mademoiselle, it is simple. One must observe, patiently and attentively. Human behavior is never random. Patterns emerge, and when they do, the truth is revealed. The little grey cells, combined with method, see all. The guests remained silent, absorbing the weight of his words. Outside, the forest stretched in pale morning light, calm and indifferent, as if unaware of the human drama that had unfolded in its midst. Poirot, small, composed, and precise, concluded, and so, Miss Amis, the mystery is solved. The perpetrator is revealed. The past, entwined with fear and ambition, has brought forth the crime. Yet order is restored, and truth illuminated. The little grey cells have triumphed. The room remained quiet, the resolution settling like dust after a storm. One mind had acted in darkness, but observation, logic, and the patient analysis of human nature had brought it to light. Wynthorpe Lodge, for the first time in days, exhaled a collective sigh of relief. Poirot, small figure by the fire, smiled faintly to himself. The forest, the shadows, the mystery, all had been unravelled, and justice, subtle and precise, had been delivered.